You answer a simple question and somehow end up explaining your entire life. Someone asks, "Why were you late?" And instead of saying traffic was bad, you explain the traffic, the parking, the phone call you received, what happened 5 minutes before you left, and why you normally aren't late. Then halfway through, you realize something. You didn't need to explain all of that, but you keep going. Because for some people, explaining isn't just about giving information, it's about making sure they're not misunderstood. And that's where the psychology gets interesting. Imagine someone sends you a message. "Why didn't you come yesterday?" A simple question, but your mind immediately starts building a defense. "I wasn't trying to avoid you. I actually wanted to come, but I had this thing earlier, and then I thought I'd still have enough time, but..." Notice what happened. Nobody accused you of anything, but your brain heard the question as if it were a judgment. So you started defending yourself before you were even asked to. This is one of the hidden patterns behind over-explaining. The fear of being misunderstood can become stronger than the need to simply communicate, and it often begins with something very subtle. A person explains because they want to be understood. Then they explain more because they want to be believed. Then they explain even more because they're afraid the other person might still have the wrong impression. Eventually, explanation becomes protection. It's almost like saying, "Please don't judge me based on what you just heard. Let me give you enough information to prove that I'm still a good person." That is very different from simply being detailed. A detailed person gives information because it is useful. An over-explainer often gives information because they are trying to control how their actions will be interpreted. And that difference matters. Think about a child who constantly gets questioned. "Why did you do that?" "Who told you to do that?" "Why didn't you do it differently?" If explanations are repeatedly met with criticism, the child can learn something powerful. I need a really good explanation to be safe. So they become experts at anticipating questions. They learn to provide context before anyone asks. They learn to defend their intentions. They learn to explain every mistake. And eventually, that behavior can follow them into adulthood. Someone asks a harmless question, and their brain immediately prepares a courtroom defense. Not because they're guilty, because they've learned to expect judgment. But here's the strange part. Over-explainers often don't realize they're doing it until afterwards. They hang up the phone and think, "Why did I just tell them all of that?" They send a long message and immediately regret it. They explain why they couldn't attend something even when nobody demanded an explanation. They justify buying something. They justify resting. They justify saying no. They justify having an opinion. And sometimes they even explain why they're explaining. That is when the pattern becomes exhausting, because every ordinary decision starts feeling like something that needs approval. There is another layer. Over-explaining can be connected to people-pleasing. If you are highly concerned with how others feel about you, ambiguity can become uncomfortable. You don't want someone to think you're rude. You don't want them to think you're lazy. You don't want them to think you don't care. So you add context, then another sentence, then another, until your simple boundary has turned into a negotiation. Instead of, "I can't make it tonight," you say, "I really wish I could, and normally I would, but I've had a really long week, and I actually thought I could make it, but then something came up." The more you explain, the more opportunities you accidentally create for someone to challenge your decision. And the irony is that you were explaining because you wanted to avoid conflict.
Here's the belief reversal. You might think over-explaining makes people understand you better. Sometimes it does the opposite. When you give too much justification, people may start wondering why the decision requires so much defense. A confident boundary often sounds surprisingly simple. "I can't come. I don't agree. I changed my mind. I need some time." No courtroom, no 10-minute closing argument, just clarity. And learning to communicate that way can feel strangely uncomfortable if you've spent years believing that every decision needs to be defended. But not every over-explainer is insecure. Some are highly conscientious. Some think deeply before speaking. Some simply grew up in environments where detailed communication was normal. Others have experienced situations where being misunderstood genuinely caused problems. So this isn't about labeling every person who talks a lot. The important question is, what happens inside you when you don't explain? If you can say what you mean and move on, there's probably no problem. But if you feel a sudden urge to keep talking because silence feels dangerous, that's worth noticing. Because underneath the extra words, there may be a much smaller sentence, one you rarely say out loud. Please don't think badly of me. That may be the real message. The explanation is simply the packaging. And once you recognize that, something changes. You stop asking, how can I explain this better? And start asking, why do I feel like I need to prove this at all? That is a much more powerful question. Imagine you're talking to someone you trust. You make a small mistake. They notice. You immediately start explaining. But they simply say, it's okay. You realize they weren't judging you. They weren't building a case against you. You were doing that part yourself. That's one of the hardest things about over-explaining. Sometimes the person you're trying hardest to convince is yourself. So the next time you feel yourself preparing a 5-minute explanation for a 2-sentence situation, pause. Ask yourself 3 questions. What actually happened? What information does this person genuinely need? And finally, am I explaining or am I defending myself? That small pause creates distance between an old habit and a new choice. You don't need to become cold. You don't need to stop giving context. You don't need to become someone who never explains anything. You simply need to stop believing that every decision requires a defense. Because healthy communication isn't about saying everything. It's about saying what matters. And perhaps the deepest reason some people over-explain everything is not that they have too much to say, it's that they've spent too long believing they need permission to be understood. They learned to anticipate judgment, to soften their opinions, to justify their boundaries, to prove their intentions. But you don't have to build a case for every part of your life. Sometimes the most confident explanation is the shortest one. Sometimes, no, I can't is enough. Sometimes that's what I decided is enough. And sometimes you can let the silence remain. Because not every misunderstanding needs to be prevented. Not every person needs to approve of you. And not every decision needs a defense. You are allowed to explain yourself when it matters, but you are also allowed to trust that your words can stand on their own. And perhaps real confidence begins when you no longer feel the need to add another sentence just to make sure someone understands that you're still worth understanding. Subscribe to Minds Over Habit, where hitting patterns become understandable.